Over 5,000 years ago, before the pyramids of Giza had reached the sky and long before the Great Wall of China took shape, an urban civilization quietly flourished in the northwestern plains of the Indian subcontinent. With its grid-planned cities, intricate drainage systems, and enigmatic script, the Indus Valley civilization remains one of the world's earliest and most advanced ancient societies. Yet, its people remain nameless, its language undeciphered. How did such a civilization emerge? And what followed after its mysterious decline? This is the story of ancient India, an epic that stretches from the earliest farming villages of Mehrgarh to the grand temples of the Cholas, from Vedic hymns and sacrificial altars to the philosophical debates of renunciants, from imperial conquest to spiritual introspection. This is the entire story of the ancient India. Let's begin. Human history on the Indian subcontinent stretches back tens of thousands of years, but the first signs of settled life began to emerge around 7000 BCE. In the dry hills of what is now Balochistan in western Pakistan, an early agricultural community known as Mehrgarh began cultivating barley and wheat, domesticating animals, and living in mud brick houses. These were among the first known farmers on the subcontinent. Mehrgarh was not a city. It was a small village, but it marks a crucial turning point, the transition from nomadic foraging to settled life. This change allowed for surplus food, population growth, and eventually, complex societies. Over the next few millennia, agriculture spread eastward into the Indus River Valley, one of the most fertile and strategically important regions in South Asia. By around 3000 BCE, clusters of farming communities in the Indus region began to form into larger towns. These settlements grew in scale, organization, and technological sophistication. Pottery became more uniform, trade networks expanded. And then, sometime around 2600 BCE, a major leap occurred. True urban centers appeared, places like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. The civilization that emerged is known to us as the Indus Valley Civilization, or sometimes the Harappan Civilization, named after one of its first excavated cities. It flourished from around 2600 to 1900 BCE and covered a vast area, larger than either ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia at the time. Its territory extended from modern-day northeast Afghanistan through Pakistan and into western India. What made the Indus cities extraordinary was not just their size, but their planning. Mohenjo-daro and Harappa were laid out on grids with wide streets intersecting at right angles. They had advanced drainage systems with covered sewers and public baths. Buildings were made from standardized baked bricks. There is evidence of complex governance, though no royal palaces or massive temples have been found. This has led scholars to suggest that political power in the Indus Valley may have been more decentralized or collective, unlike the divine kingship seen in Egypt or Mesopotamia. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro, a large brick-lined pool, may have had ritual significance. Granaries and storage facilities suggest surplus management, and the sheer uniformity of artifacts across cities, weights, seals, pottery, indicates a high degree of standardization. This points to extensive internal trade and perhaps a shared cultural or administrative system across the civilization. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Indus Valley civilization is its script. Thousands of seals and inscribed tablets have been found, marked with short sequences of symbols. However, the script has never been definitively deciphered. Without readable texts, historians must rely on material evidence, artifacts, buildings, and patterns of trade to understand how this society functioned. Despite this, what is clear is that the people of the Indus Valley were highly connected. They traded with Mesopotamia. Sumerian records refer to a place called Meluha, which many scholars believe refers to the Indus region. Goods like lapis lazuli, carnelian beads, and cotton cloth traveled from the subcontinent to the ancient Near East. Indus seals have been found in Mesopotamian cities, and Mesopotamian-style artifacts have turned up in Harappan contexts. Daily life in these cities likely revolved around farming, craftsmanship, and trade. The economy was supported by irrigation and seasonal flooding of the Indus River, which deposited nutrient-rich silt across the plains. People grew wheat, barley, cotton, and perhaps rice. They raised cattle, sheep, and goats. Craftsmen worked in stone, shell, and metal. Some neighborhoods appear to have been devoted to specific industries: bead-making, pottery, metallurgy. Society seems to have been relatively egalitarian. There is little evidence of extreme wealth or grand monuments. Most houses, large or small, had access to water and drainage. There are no elaborate tombs or obvious royal burials, which sets the Indus Valley apart from other early civilizations. But sometime after 1900 BCE, the cities began to decline. Trade with Mesopotamia ceased. Urban centers were gradually abandoned. Writing disappeared. The reasons for this collapse are still debated. Climate change likely played a role. A shift in monsoon patterns may have led to droughts or unpredictable floods. The rivers themselves may have changed course. Some scholars point to the drying of the Ghaggar-Hakra River, often identified with the ancient Sarasvati, as a key factor. There is no evidence of a dramatic invasion or military conquest. Instead, it appears to have been a slow unraveling. As urban life faded, people returned to smaller rural settlements. However, the legacy of the Indus Valley did not vanish. Some cultural practices, such as town planning, craft traditions, and possibly religious symbols, may have survived and influenced later societies in the subcontinent. It is important to recognize that the Indus Valley civilization was not an isolated phenomenon. It was part of a broader pattern of urbanization in the ancient world, but it developed its own unique features. Its cities, engineering, and regional reach place it among the great Bronze Age civilizations. Yet because we cannot read their script and have no known texts, the people of the Indus remain largely silent in the historical record. What survives are their bricks, their beads, and their patterns. This makes their story a puzzle built from material clues. By around 1900 BCE, the great cities of the Indus Valley civilization, Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and their many smaller counterparts, had begun to falter. The once thriving urban centers that had stretched across a vast region from modern-day eastern Afghanistan to western India were gradually depopulated. Planned streets fell into disuse. Long-distance trade declined. The standardization that had once unified the region began to vanish. The fall of the Indus cities did not happen overnight. It was a slow and uneven process, unfolding over several centuries. But by around 1300 BCE, the urban phase of the Indus Valley civilization had come to an end. There is no evidence of violent destruction on a large scale. Unlike Mesopotamian cities that were often razed in war, the ruins of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro show little sign of fire or conquest. Instead, historians and archaeologists point to environmental causes. Shifting river patterns, especially the drying of the Ghaggar-Hakra River, which many associate with the legendary Sarasvati, likely disrupted agriculture and trade. Repeated flooding of the Indus itself may have made cities uninhabitable. Climate data also suggests a weakening of the monsoon system during this period, resulting in drought and water stress. In this context of ecological pressure and urban decline, a new cultural presence began to emerge in the northwestern plains of the subcontinent. These were the Indo-Aryans, a group of Indo-European-speaking peoples who migrated into the region in waves, likely beginning around 1500 BCE or earlier. Their arrival would reshape the religious, linguistic, and social fabric of ancient India. The Indo-Aryans were not a single unified tribe. They were part of a broader set of migrations from Central Asia that affected regions from Europe to Iran to South Asia. They brought with them a language that would evolve into Sanskrit and a body of oral literature, the Vedas, that formed the core of early Indian religious thought. The earliest of these texts, the Rig Veda, is a collection of over 1,000 hymns composed in an archaic form of Sanskrit. Scholars date the Rig Veda's composition to somewhere between 1500 and 1200 BCE. though the tradition itself likely began earlier. These hymns were passed down orally by specialist priests or rishis who ensured their precise memorization across generations. The world of the Rig Veda was not urban. It was pastoral and tribal. The hymns describe a society organized around kinship groups, cattle herding, and seasonal movement. Cows were a primary measure of wealth, and horses played a major role in mobility and warfare. Chariots were symbols of power. The Rigvedic people lived in small settlements rather than cities, and their lives revolved around rituals, sacrifice, and the worship of natural forces: sky, fire, wind, rivers, and the sun. Central to this worldview was the idea of RTA, or cosmic order. The maintenance of RTA required proper ritual action, particularly the offering of fire sacrifices, yajnas, to the gods. Agni, the fire god, acted as a mediator between humans and the divine. Indra, the warrior god, was celebrated for his strength in defeating enemies and releasing the waters held back by a cosmic serpent. Varuna represented moral order and cosmic law. These hymns do not speak of temples or idols. The divine was invoked in the open, with fire altars and recited verses. This early form of Vedic religion was dynamic, deeply oral, and tied closely to the cycles of nature and social life. As Indo-Aryan culture spread eastward into the Gangetic Plain, it gradually absorbed and interacted with the remnants of earlier populations. This was not a replacement of one civilization by another in a clean break. Instead, it was a prolonged period of contact, exchange, and adaptation. Archaeological evidence shows a mixing of material cultures. Pottery styles, burial practices, and settlement patterns evolved gradually. One such example is the painted gray ware culture, found mainly in the western Gangetic region and dated roughly from 1100 to 600 BCE. This culture, while associated with later Vedic communities, also shows continuity with earlier traditions in the region. It suggests that rather than a single moment of conquest or migration, there was a long process of integration and transformation. The Indo-Aryan presence also brought new social structures. The Vedic texts describe a division of society into four broad groups, or varnas: priests, brahmanas, warriors, kshatriyas, commoners, vaishyas, and servants, shudras. Initially, these were likely fluid categories, but over time, they hardened into more rigid social hierarchies. The role of the brahmanas, those who mastered the Vedic rituals and sacred speech, became increasingly central. Their authority was not based on force or wealth, but on knowledge and ritual power. This priestly class would go on to shape religious and cultural life in profound ways. Yet, during this early Vedic period, political power was still relatively decentralized. Society was organized around janas, tribes, and rajans, chieftains. These leaders were often elected or selected by consensus, and their power was constrained by assemblies such as the Sabha and the Samiti. Warfare between tribes was common, often described in the Rig Veda as battles for cattle and territory. One of the most memorable events mentioned in the Rig Veda is the Battle of 10 Kings, a large conflict between the Bharatas, a leading Vedic tribe, and a confederation of other tribes along the Ravi River. The Bharatas, under their king Sudas, emerged victorious. Though the event's details are poetic and symbolic, it reflects a world of competing tribal interests and shifting alliances. As the Indo-Aryans moved further east into the more densely forested Gangetic Plain, they encountered new challenges and opportunities. The land was fertile but heavily wooded, requiring clearing and new methods of agriculture. Iron tools, which began to appear around 1000 BCE, played a key role in this expansion. Settlements became more permanent, and by the end of the second millennium BCE, the stage was set for the emergence of larger political units and cities once again. Meanwhile, the oral tradition continued to evolve. Later Vedic texts, such as the Yajurveda, Samaveda, and Atharva Veda, expanded the ritual canon. The Brahmanas, ritual commentaries, Aranyakas, forest treatises, and Upanishads, philosophical dialogues, emerged over the next few centuries, reflecting deeper questions about existence, ethics, and the cosmos. These texts began to shift the focus from outward ritual to inward understanding, hinting at the spiritual developments that would later give rise to classical Indian philosophy. The collapse of the Indus cities and the rise of Vedic culture was not simply a fall followed by a rise. It was a long, complex transformation, from urban life to rural, from undeciphered script to spoken Sanskrit, from centralized towns to decentralized tribes, and from one worldview to another. It involved migration, adaptation, innovation, and continuity. By 1300 BCE, the old urban centers of the Indus were gone, but a new cultural foundation had been laid. The Vedic tradition, carried by poets and priests, would come to define much of India's ancient intellectual and spiritual legacy. By the middle of the second millennium BCE, the Indo-Aryan communities that had migrated into the northwestern regions of the Indian subcontinent had begun to settle more permanently. Their early existence was largely pastoral, marked by cattle herding, kin-based tribal organization, and frequent conflict over land and resources. Over time, however, these groups transitioned into more agrarian lifestyles, leading to the development of a more stratified society, expanding religious practices, and the early foundations of Indian philosophy. This period, broadly spanning from 1500 to 600 BCE, is known as the Vedic Age. It takes its name from the Vedas, an extensive body of religious hymns and texts composed in early Sanskrit. These were not written documents, but oral compositions, preserved with remarkable precision by generations of Brahmanas through memorization and ritual recitation. At the center of this cultural and religious world stood the Rig Veda, the oldest of the four Vedas. It offered a poetic and often symbolic window into the lives, concerns, and cosmology of the Indo-Aryan peoples. Alongside it, the Yajurveda, Samaveda, and Atharva Veda were composed over the following centuries, each serving specific ritual or liturgical purposes. Vedic society was structured not as a single unified state, but as a patchwork of tribes known as Janas. These tribes were led by chieftains, or Rajans, who were often selected by tribal councils such as the Sabha and Samiti. Power was not absolute. A Rajan had to gain and maintain the trust of his warriors and elders. This balance of authority ensured that early political life was participatory, at least among the dominant male elite. The economy of the early Vedic period remained largely pastoral. Wealth was measured in cattle, and the hymns of the Rig Veda are filled with references to cows, bulls, and herds. Horses were also prized, both as symbols of mobility and for their role in warfare and rituals. Gradually, however, agriculture became more prominent. The clearing of forests allowed for settled farming, and the growing surplus supported population increases and more permanent communities. As society became more complex, so too did its internal divisions. The Varna system emerged during this period as a way of organizing people into broad social categories. At the top were the Brahmanas, who specialized in rituals and the preservation of sacred knowledge. Below them were the Kshatriyas, the warrior and ruling class. Next came the Vaishyas, who engaged in agriculture, trade, and animal husbandry. At the bottom were the Shudras, tasked with serving the upper three Varnas. It is important to note that the early Varna system was likely fluid. Social roles were not yet fully fixed by birth. But over time, as religious and political power consolidated, these categories hardened into rigid hierarchies. Later, Vedic texts would attempt to justify this order through myths of cosmic origin, most notably in the Purusha Sukta of the Rig Veda, where the universe is said to have been created from the body of a cosmic being, his mouth becoming the Brahmanas, his arms the Kshatriyas, his thighs the Vaishyas, and his feet the Shudras. This hierarchy was not just social but spiritual. The Brahmanas held a special place as intermediaries between the human and divine realms. Their expertise in performing sacrifices, yajnas, gave them immense authority. These rituals were seen as essential for maintaining cosmic balance, pleasing the gods, and ensuring prosperity. The most elaborate of these rituals was the Ashvamedha, or horse sacrifice, in which a horse was allowed to wander freely for a year under royal guard. The land it traversed symbolically came under the dominion of the king. At the end of the year, the horse was ritually sacrificed, and a complex set of ceremonies followed. Such sacrifices were markers of political ambition and religious prestige. The gods of the Vedic pantheon reflected the priorities of a mobile, hierarchical, and male-dominated society. Indra, the thunder-wielding warrior, was the most frequently invoked deity. He was praised for slaying Vritra, the demon who held back the waters, thus releasing the rivers and enabling life. Agni, the fire god, was present in every sacrifice, carrying offerings from the human world to the divine. Varuna governed moral order, while Mitra represented agreements and contracts. These gods were not imagined as distant or abstract. They were invoked through hymns, praised with poetry, and appealed to for rain, victory, and wealth. The act of speaking, especially in verse, was itself seen as powerful. In the Vedic worldview, the universe was born from sacred sound. The word was not just a vehicle for truth, it was truth. As the Vedic Age progressed, its religious thought began to evolve. The later Vedic period, from around 1000 to 600 BCE, saw a shift in geographical focus from the northwest to the eastern Gangetic Plains. This region, with its fertile soil and abundant rainfall, supported denser populations and more settled agricultural communities. With this shift came the rise of new forms of political organization. Small kingdoms, or Janapadas, began to emerge, replacing the older tribal system. Some of these eventually developed into larger states with standing armies, fortified cities, and centralized administration. The religious texts also changed. The Brahmanas, composed during this time, offered detailed instructions on ritual performance and the correct way to carry out sacrifices. These texts were concerned not just with devotion, but with exactness. Every word, gesture, and offering had to be precise to maintain cosmic order. Yet alongside this ritual complexity, a new line of thought was emerging. The Aranyakas, or forest texts, and the Upanishads, composed by hermits and thinkers who withdrew from worldly life, began to question the very basis of ritual. Instead of external sacrifice, they emphasized internal understanding. What is the self? What is the origin of the universe? What happens after death? One of the central concepts introduced in the Upanishads is Brahman, the ultimate unchanging reality underlying all existence. The individual self, or Atman, was seen as identical to Brahman. Realizing this identity became the goal of spiritual practice. This marked a profound philosophical development, shifting the focus from action to knowledge, from the external world to inner realization. These ideas would later form the core of Indian philosophical traditions and influence religious systems like Vedanta, Buddhism, and Jainism. They also introduced a tension that would persist throughout Indian history, the tension between ritual orthodoxy and personal enlightenment, between the householder and the renunciant. The Vedic Age, then, was not a single monolithic period. It was a time of deep change, from migration to settlement, from tribal chieftains to monarchs, from simple rituals to complex metaphysics. The power of the spoken word, the authority of the Brahmanas, and the search for cosmic truth all took root in this formative era. By the 6th century BCE, the landscape of northern India had changed dramatically. The tribal and semi-nomadic communities of the earlier Vedic period had gradually transformed into larger, more complex societies. Forests had been cleared, agriculture had intensified, iron tools had become common, making farming more productive and allowing for the growth of surplus food. With this economic stability came social and political change. Across the northern plains, particularly in the region between the Himalayas and the Vindhya Mountains, settled communities began organizing themselves into political units known as Janapadas. These were territories associated with particular peoples or clans, and they marked the early formation of kingdoms. Over time, some of these Janapadas grew in strength and territory, becoming known as Mahajanapadas, literally, great realms. By around 500 BCE, there were 16 prominent Mahajanapadas mentioned in ancient texts such as the Anguttara Nikaya, a Buddhist scripture. These included powerful states like Magadha, Kosala, Vatsa, and Avanti, as well as smaller republics such as the Vrijis and Malas. Some were monarchies ruled by kings, while others were Ganasanghas, or oligarchic republics, where decisions were made by assemblies of nobles or elders. The rise of the Mahajanapadas marked a return to urbanism not seen since the days of the Indus Valley civilization. Cities like Rajagriha, Ujjain, Kaushambi, and Shravasti became centers of commerce, administration, and intellectual life. Fortifications, palaces, and marketplaces became common features. The Gangetic Plain, especially, became a hub of cultural and economic activity owing to its fertile soil and expanding population. As cities grew, so did trade. Merchants, artisans, and guilds played an increasingly important role in society. Coinage began to appear for the first time, punch-marked silver coins that facilitated commercial transactions across regions. Roads connected cities, and caravans carried goods such as spices, textiles, metalwork, and grains. The economy was becoming more monetized and interconnected. This new urban context provided the backdrop for significant intellectual and spiritual ferment. People began to ask deeper questions, not just about the rituals of the Vedas, but about the nature of suffering, the meaning of life, and the possibility of liberation. The growing complexity and inequality of society, including the burdens of caste and the accumulation of wealth, led many to seek alternative paths. This environment gave rise to what historians call the Shramana movement, a broad and diverse range of thinkers and seekers who renounced worldly life to pursue truth, self-discipline, and spiritual insight. The term Shramana comes from the root shram, meaning effort or striving. These individuals rejected the authority of the Vedas and the dominance of the Brahmanas, instead advocating for personal experience, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. Among the many teachers who emerged during this time, two figures would come to have a profound and lasting impact: Gautama Buddha and Vardhamana Mahavira. Both came from the warrior class of the Kshatriyas and belonged to the regions of the eastern Mahajanapadas. Both renounced royal life in search of truth, and both would found religious traditions, Buddhism and Jainism, that offered radically different alternatives to Vedic ritualism. But before exploring their teachings, it is important to understand the social and political structure that framed their world. The Mahajanapadas were often in competition, and war was a common feature of the time. Kingdoms fought for control of trade routes, fertile lands, and strategic rivers. Among them, the kingdom of Magadha in present-day Bihar began to assert dominance. Its capital, Rajagriha, was fortified and strategically located. Magadha controlled key resources like iron ore and elephants, both vital for military success. The monarchy in Magadha was supported by a centralized bureaucracy and a strong army. Later rulers would expand its territory and influence, laying the groundwork for India's first great empires. But for now, Magadha was one among many, part of a complex and dynamic political landscape. Meanwhile, religious life was also transforming. The old Vedic sacrifices, once performed in rural settings with fire altars and hymns, had been adapted to serve the needs of urban society. The Brahmanas continued to hold prestige, but they were no longer the sole voices in the spiritual realm. The Shramanas challenged them by teaching that salvation, or moksha, could be achieved not through ritual, but through ethical living, meditation, and insight. This was also a time of growing textual production. The early Upanishads, composed toward the end of the Vedic period, had already introduced concepts like Atman and Brahman, the unity of the individual soul and cosmic reality. Now, those ideas were taken further, debated, and sometimes rejected entirely by new schools of thought. The rise of the Mahajanapadas also led to the formation of formal philosophical traditions. Thinkers no longer acted only as lone ascetics, but often organized followers, taught in public spaces, and attracted patrons. Royal courts became centers of intellectual activity. Debates between competing teachers were common, and kings often sponsored religious discussions. sometimes adopting new beliefs themselves. One striking feature of this era was its openness to dialogue. The Pali Canon, a key collection of early Buddhist texts, records many conversations between the Buddha and rival teachers, including Brahmanas, skeptics, materialists, and Jain ascetics. This pluralistic atmosphere fostered innovation, but it also created competition. Different schools vied for disciples, resources, and political support. Alongside Buddhism and Jainism, other philosophical traditions emerged during this time, such as the Ajivikas, who believed in strict determinism, and various materialist schools who denied the existence of the soul. These movements shared a common rejection of Vedic authority and often questioned the validity of caste, sacrifice, and priesthood. The growing diversity of thought reshaped Indian culture. Monasteries were founded, ethical codes were written down, teachers traveled widely, spreading ideas across kingdoms. Some rulers began to align themselves with these new teachings, seeing them as sources of legitimacy and moral authority. By the end of the 5th century BCE, the Indian subcontinent had undergone a profound transformation. The tribal world of earlier centuries had given way to organized kingdoms and urban centers. The Vedic tradition, once dominant, now shared the religious stage with powerful alternatives. Social mobility had become more restricted, and caste distinctions were hardening. Yet new paths of liberation had opened. By the 5th century BCE, the Indian subcontinent was undergoing intense religious and intellectual change. In the urban centers of the Mahajanapadas, amid rising trade, growing wealth, and expanding political power, a new spiritual restlessness was taking shape. While the ritual-heavy practices of the Brahmanas remained dominant, many individuals began to seek different answers, ones that went beyond ritual, caste, or inherited status. It was in this atmosphere of questioning and reform that two of India's most important religious figures arose, Gautama Buddha and Vardhamana Mahavira. These men did not appear in a vacuum. They emerged from the broader Shramana tradition, a movement that had already gained traction among those disillusioned by Vedic orthodoxy. The Shramanas rejected the authority of the Vedas, the power of the Brahmanas, and the idea that ritual sacrifice was the only path to liberation. Instead, they promoted asceticism, ethical conduct, self-control, and personal insight. Gautama, later known as the Buddha, was born in the Shakya clan, located in the foothills of the Himalayas, in what is now southern Nepal. His birth is traditionally dated to the mid-6th century BCE. He was born Siddhartha, a prince of the Kshatriya class. According to early sources, he lived a sheltered and privileged life until he encountered the realities of suffering, old age, sickness, and death. These experiences prompted him to abandon royal life in search of a deeper understanding of human existence. After years of extreme ascetic practices and philosophical exploration, Siddhartha attained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya. From that point forward, he became the Buddha, the awakened one. He taught that all life involves suffering, caused by desire and attachment. The path to liberation, he said, was the elimination of craving through ethical living, mental discipline, and insight. His doctrine was framed around 4 noble truths and an 8-fold path, emphasizing right action, right thought, and right mindfulness. Buddha's teachings were revolutionary not just in content, but in accessibility. He rejected the idea that birth or ritual purity determined one's spiritual worth. Instead, he opened his community to people from all backgrounds, monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen, regardless of caste. He preached in local dialects rather than Sanskrit, making his ideas more accessible to the masses. His followers formed a monastic community known as the Sangha. These monks and nuns lived under a simple code of conduct, meditated regularly, and traveled to spread the Buddha's message. The lay community supported them with food and shelter, creating a symbiotic relationship that helped the movement grow. Over time, Buddhist monasteries became important centers of learning and refuge. While the Buddha emphasized non-theistic ethical living and internal discipline, Mahavira, his contemporary and the founder of Jainism, took asceticism to a more radical conclusion. Mahavira was born Vardhamana in the kingdom of the Lichavis, also part of the eastern Mahajanapadas. Like Siddhartha, he came from a royal Kshatriya family and renounced worldly life to become an ascetic. After 12 years of intense austerity, Vardhamana attained Kevalajnana, or absolute knowledge. He came to be known as Mahavira, meaning great hero. Mahavira was the 24th and final Tirthankara, a spiritual teacher in Jain tradition who shows the path to liberation. His teachings centered on 5 great vows: non-violence, truthfulness, non-stealing, celibacy, and non-possession. Of these, non-violence, or ahimsa, was paramount. Jains extended this principle to its logical extreme, avoiding harm to any living being, including insects and microorganisms. Jain monks and nuns practiced strict asceticism, wearing simple robes or none at all, using sweepers to avoid stepping on insects, and fasting frequently. Like the Buddha, Mahavira rejected the Vedic sacrificial system and the caste hierarchy. He argued that spiritual purity came from personal conduct, not from social status or ritual performance. Jainism, like Buddhism, also formed monastic orders. While the monks lived lives of severe self-denial, the lay Jain community played an important role in supporting them. Jain traders and merchants became influential patrons of the religion, particularly in urban centers. Though both Buddhism and Jainism arose from the same Shramana milieu, there were key differences. Buddhism was more moderate in its asceticism and placed a strong emphasis on the middle path between self-indulgence and self-mortification. Jainism, by contrast, held that extreme austerity was necessary for liberation. Both traditions, however, shared a deep commitment to ethical conduct, meditation, and liberation from the cycle of birth and death. These new religious movements did not erase the older Vedic tradition. Instead, they coexisted alongside it, contributing to a more pluralistic religious environment. Kings and urban elites often supported multiple traditions simultaneously. For instance, some rulers built Vedic altars while also sponsoring Buddhist monasteries or Jain temples. This openness allowed diverse ideas to flourish and interact. The political and economic conditions of the Mahajanapadas played a critical role in the spread of these movements. As trade increased and cities grew, merchants and artisans found in Buddhism and Jainism a religious framework that valued individual merit over inherited status. The rejection of caste distinctions made these faiths attractive to those outside the traditional upper classes. Moreover, the establishment of monastic institutions gave these religions organizational strength. Monasteries served not only as religious centers, but also as hubs of education, healthcare, and charity. They provided a stable base for the transmission of teachings, the copying of texts, and the training of new monks and nuns. In this period, oral traditions remained dominant, but early texts began to take shape. The teachings of the Buddha were preserved in the Pali Canon by his followers, while Jain scriptures were compiled in Prakrit, a language more accessible than Sanskrit. These texts recorded sermons, philosophical debates, rules for monastic life, and stories of past Buddhas and Tirthankaras. As both religions spread, they also began to diverge internally. Different schools of thought developed within Buddhism, such as the Theravada and later the Mahayana traditions. Similarly, Jainism evolved into 2 main sects: the Digambaras, who embraced nudity as a sign of renunciation, and the Svetambaras, who wore white robes. Despite these internal differences, the legacy of Buddha and Mahavira endured. They offered compelling answers to the spiritual anxieties of their time. They questioned established norms, emphasized personal responsibility, and made spiritual practice more accessible. Their teachings would go on to shape not only Indian civilization, but also regions far beyond, as Buddhism in particular began to spread across Asia. By the 4th century BCE, the political map of northern India had narrowed from a wide array of Mahajanapadas to a few dominant powers, with one standing above the rest, the kingdom of Magadha. Once a mid-level player among its peers, Magadha had steadily risen to prominence, absorbing rivals and expanding its reach across the Gangetic plains. Its rulers built strong fortifications, maintained powerful armies, and developed systems of taxation that supported ambitious state-building. This rise culminated in the Nanda dynasty, an often overlooked but crucial chapter in Indian history. The Nanda dynasty emerged in the mid-4th century BCE after the fall of the Shishunaga dynasty, which had earlier unified much of Magadha and relocated its capital to Pataliputra, a city strategically located at the confluence of the Ganga and Sun rivers. Pataliputra would go on to become one of the most important urban centers in ancient India, an administrative, cultural, and military hub that would later rival the great cities of the classical world. The founder of the Nanda dynasty was Mahapadma Nanda, a figure both respected and resented by later sources. According to Puranic tradition, Mahapadma was of low caste, perhaps even the son of a barber or a Shudra mother, who rose to power and seized the throne of Magadha through force and cunning. While these origins may have been exaggerated or distorted by hostile Brahmanical sources, they reflect a significant truth. The Nandas did not belong to the traditional Kshatriya nobility. Their rise represented a shift in power from lineage-based aristocracies to monarchies based on wealth, bureaucracy, and military strength. Mahapadma Nanda is described as the destroyer of all other Kshatriyas. He is credited with conquering and annexing several of the remaining independent states, effectively bringing large parts of the northern subcontinent under Magadhan control. Though the exact extent of his conquests is difficult to verify, the administrative and military strength of the Nanda state was widely recognized. The Nandas ruled through centralized power, supported by a standing army reputed in later sources to be immense. Greek accounts, especially those from the time of Alexander of Macedon's campaigns in the northwest, mention a Nanda king with an army of 200,000 infantry, 20,000 cavalry, 2,000 war chariots, and 3,000 elephants. While these numbers may be exaggerated, they speak to the awe in which the Nanda military was held. To sustain such an army, the Nandas imposed an efficient and heavy taxation system. They are said to have levied taxes not only on land and produce, but also on items such as water, skins, and even prostitution. This taxation allowed for wealth accumulation, but it also made the Nandas deeply unpopular among many segments of society, particularly the Brahmanas and merchants, who felt burdened or excluded from the court's favor. Despite their power, the Nandas left behind few monuments or inscriptions. Their legacy is largely preserved through hostile traditions, Buddhist, Jain, and Brahmanical, all of which criticize their greed, arrogance, and disregard for religious norms. Yet these same criticisms hint at how transformative the Nanda rule was. They broke the mold of aristocratic kingship, they centralized authority, and they laid the institutional foundation for the empire that would follow. While Magadha expanded under the Nandas, the western part of the subcontinent faced an entirely different kind of political development. In the year that corresponds to approximately 327 BCE, Alexander of Macedon crossed into the Indian subcontinent after having conquered the Achaemenid Empire. His campaign into the Punjab region brought him into conflict with Indian rulers such as King Porus of the Paurava kingdom. Alexander's invasion did not penetrate deep into the subcontinent. After defeating Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes River, he was impressed enough by Porus's courage to allow him to remain in power as a subordinate ally. However, when Alexander's exhausted troops refused to march further east, fearing the great Nanda army they had heard about, he turned back toward Babylon. His incursion lasted only a few years, but it created significant ripple effects. First, it brought the Indian subcontinent into closer contact with the Hellenistic world. Greek settlements were established in the northwest, and Greek accounts provide valuable historical observations. Second, Alexander's departure left a power vacuum in the Indus region, destabilizing local rulers and opening the door for new powers to emerge. Third, the fear that Alexander might return or that other foreign powers might invade galvanized political consolidation in the heartland of the Gangetic Plain. Amidst this shifting landscape, A new figure began to rise, one who would overthrow the Nandas and found the first empire to unify most of the Indian subcontinent. This was Chandragupta Maurya. But Chandragupta's rise was not an accident. It was the product of a society already primed for centralized rule, military expansion, and ideological ambition. According to traditional accounts, Chandragupta was of humble origin, either from the Kshatriya or a lower caste, and was mentored by a brilliant and ruthless Brahmana named Chanakya, also known as Kautilya. Chanakya, having been insulted by the Nanda king, likely Dana Nanda, the last ruler of the dynasty, vowed revenge. He took Chandragupta under his wing and began building a coalition of allies, soldiers, and disaffected regional leaders. What followed was a political and military campaign to overthrow the Nandas. The details vary across sources, but the outcome is clear. The Nanda dynasty, despite its wealth and army, collapsed under the combined pressure of internal discontent and external challenge. Chandragupta captured Pataliputra, expelled Dana Nanda, and declared himself ruler. Thus began the Mauryan Empire. The downfall of the Nandas marks a critical moment in Indian history. It was the end of a dynasty that had pioneered the machinery of empire but failed to win broad legitimacy or enduring support. It was also the beginning of a new era, one in which political unification, administrative complexity, and philosophical engagement would come together under the Mauryan state. Yet the legacy of the Nandas should not be dismissed. They demonstrated that power could be built on economic strength and military organization rather than lineage alone. They showed that a king could rule through bureaucracy and taxation rather than just through alliances and rituals. And they proved that Magadha, with its fertile lands and strategic location, would remain the beating heart of political power in ancient India. The collapse of the Nanda dynasty in the early 4th century BCE created a political vacuum in the eastern Gangetic plains. This moment of disruption also opened an extraordinary opportunity. From these shifting foundations rose one of the most significant rulers in Indian history, Chandragupta Maurya. He would establish the subcontinent's first pan-Indian empire, unifying fragmented regions under a single administration and transforming the political landscape of ancient India. Chandragupta's early life is cloaked in partial mystery, with historical sources offering differing versions. Some texts portray him as a prince of noble birth who lost his claim to the throne, while others describe him as a youth of modest origins, trained by the cunning Brahmana scholar Chanakya. What remains consistent across traditions is that Chanakya, also known as Kautilya or Vishnugupta, played a decisive role in shaping Chandragupta's destiny. Chanakya, an erudite strategist and author of the Arthashastra, a treatise on statecraft, economics, and military strategy, recognized in Chandragupta the ambition and potential to lead. Together, they rallied support among disaffected allies, regional rulers, and mercenary forces to challenge the unpopular Nanda regime. After a series of calculated moves and campaigns, Chandragupta succeeded in overthrowing Dana Nanda and taking control of the Magadhan capital, Pataliputra, around the year 322 BCE. With this victory, the Mauryan dynasty was born, but consolidating power in Magadha was only the beginning. Chandragupta quickly turned his attention outward. He embarked on a campaign to unite the politically fragmented regions of northern India, territories still reeling from internal conflict and the echoes of Alexander of Macedon's brief but disruptive incursion into the northwest. Following Alexander's departure from India in the late 4th century BCE, his easternmost territories fell into the hands of Seleucus Nicator, one of his generals and the founder of the Seleucid Empire. Seleucus attempted to regain control over the Indian territories in the Punjab region, but he encountered strong resistance from Chandragupta. Rather than continuing a protracted war, the two leaders reached a diplomatic settlement around 303 BCE. Seleucus ceded large territories, possibly including the regions of Arachosia, Gedrosia, and parts of Paropamisadai, to the Mauryan Empire. In exchange, Chandragupta offered 500 war elephants, a highly valued asset in Hellenistic warfare. The peace was further cemented by a marriage alliance, although details remain unclear. This treaty marked a rare and significant moment of Indo-Greek diplomacy and ensured Mauryan dominance in the northwest. The Mauryan Empire, under Chandragupta's leadership, expanded rapidly. It eventually stretched from the Hindu Kush in the northwest to the Bay of Bengal in the east, and from the Himalayas in the north to the Narmada River in central India. This vast expanse was governed through a centralized administration, guided in part by the principles laid out in the Arthashastra. The Arthashastra, though attributed to Chanakya, likely evolved over time. Nonetheless, it reflects the intellectual rigor of the Mauryan state. It covers governance, economics, espionage, law, agriculture, taxation, and military organization. The treatise emphasizes realism, surveillance, and control, a vision of the state as a disciplined hierarchical machine meant to ensure order and prosperity. Chandragupta built his court at Pataliputra, which had grown into a thriving metropolis. According to the Greek ambassador Megasthenes, who visited during Chandragupta's reign, Pataliputra was a city of grandeur. Megasthenes' account, preserved in fragments by later writers, describes wide avenues, wooden houses raised on platforms, and formidable walls guarded by towers and gates. He noted the presence of a council of 30 officials overseeing different functions of governance: justice, trade, agriculture, and more. The Mauryan government was highly structured. At the top stood the emperor, advised by a council of ministers. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by royal appointees. These provinces were further divided into districts and villages, managed by local officials and scribes. A well-maintained network of roads and messengers allowed for swift communication and administrative efficiency. A key innovation of Mauryan rule was its emphasis on surveillance and intelligence. Spies and informants were employed across the empire to report on public sentiment, administrative integrity, and threats to the throne. This system helped the state monitor dissent and enforce policy, but also reveals a government deeply concerned with stability and control. Economically, the Mauryan state relied on land revenue as its primary source of income. Land was surveyed, measured, and taxed. Irrigation systems were maintained, and trade routes were protected. Standardized weights, measures, and coinage facilitated commerce, while markets were regulated to ensure fair pricing and quality. The state also maintained large granaries and storehouses as a buffer against famine. Chandragupta's reign was not only about conquest and governance. Later Jain traditions claim that in his later years, the emperor grew disillusioned with power and embraced spiritual life. According to these accounts, he abdicated the throne in favor of his son Bindusara and became a follower of Jainism under the guidance of the monk Bhadrabahu. Chandragupta is said to have migrated south to Karnataka, where he spent his final years in meditation and fasting at a hill called Shravanabelagola. While historians debate the literal accuracy of this account, it underscores the moral expectations placed upon rulers in Indian traditions. Kings were not merely conquerors, they were also expected to uphold dharma, a concept that, by this period, had evolved to encompass duty, justice, and ethical conduct. Chandragupta Maurya's legacy is profound. He was the first Indian ruler to create a centralized empire that spanned much of the subcontinent. His reign marked the beginning of a new political order, one that combined military strength with bureaucratic administration, economic planning, and legal structure. He demonstrated that Indian polities could match the size and sophistication of other great empires of the ancient world. He also set a precedent for future rulers, most notably his grandson Ashoka, who would inherit the empire and take it to its spiritual and territorial peak. But Chandragupta's story remains essential in its own right. From a displaced youth to an empire builder, he embodied a new model of kingship, pragmatic, ambitious, and transformative. After Chandragupta, Maurya laid the foundations of a unified empire, and his son Bindusara expanded its reach across peninsular India. The Mauryan dynasty entered its most transformative phase under the rule of Ashoka. This was a period not only of territorial might, but also of moral introspection, where the ideals of conquest and kingship were questioned in light of ethical values and social responsibility. Ashoka, known in historical inscriptions as Devanampiya Piyadasi, meaning beloved of the gods, and he who looks with affection, ascended the Mauryan throne around 268 BCE. His rise to power was not without conflict. Historical sources, including Buddhist chronicles, mention a violent struggle for succession following the death of his father, Bindusara. Ashoka reportedly defeated his brothers in a brutal campaign, eventually securing control over the empire's vast territory. Once in power, Ashoka continued the policies of centralization and military strength. In the early years of his reign, he functioned much like previous Mauryan rulers, maintaining order, extending influence, and reinforcing the administrative structures inherited from his predecessors. However, one event would change the course of his life and Indian history. That event was the conquest of Kalinga, a prosperous coastal region located in present-day Odisha. Kalinga had remained outside Mauryan control and was known for its independence and maritime trade. Ashoka launched a military campaign to annex it, likely for both strategic and economic reasons. The war, which took place around the 8th year of his reign, was devastating. According to Ashoka's own inscriptions, particularly the 13th Rock Edict, over 100,000 people were killed, many more were injured, and thousands were deported. The destruction was so immense that it shocked Ashoka's conscience. Unlike other conquerors who glorified their victories, Ashoka expressed deep remorse. He wrote, "If 100th or 1,000th part of those who were killed or died or were taken away had suffered the same fate in my own household, it would have been unbearable to me." This statement, carved into stone and distributed across the empire, marks one of the most remarkable moral admissions by a ruler in the ancient world. Ashoka's grief led him to adopt a new path. He embraced Buddhism, not as a sectarian religion, but as an ethical framework for ruling justly. His conversion was not sudden. Buddhist sources mention earlier interactions with monks and a gradual process of spiritual awakening. But after Kalinga, Ashoka fully committed himself to the ideals of nonviolence, compassion, and dharma. The word dharma, central to Ashoka's ideology, did not refer to Buddhist doctrine alone. It was a broader concept encompassing moral duty, kindness, self-control, and respect for all living beings. Ashoka's Dhamma, as rendered in Prakrit inscriptions, was a set of ethical principles meant to guide individual behavior and governance alike. To promote these values, Ashoka undertook an ambitious program of communication. He ordered the carving of edicts on rocks and pillars across the empire. These inscriptions, written in local dialects and scripts, addressed topics such as religious tolerance, humane treatment of prisoners, proper conduct of officials, and respect for elders, parents, and teachers. For the first time in Indian history, a ruler spoke directly to his subjects in their own language. Ashoka also appointed special officers called Dhamma Mahamatras, literally, officers of the Dharma, to oversee the moral welfare of the people. These officials traveled the empire, advising communities, promoting ethical conduct, and reporting on social conditions. The bureaucracy thus gained a new dimension, incorporating moral outreach alongside administration. Another major shift in Ashoka's rule was his approach to foreign policy. He maintained diplomatic relations with Hellenistic kingdoms, including those of Egypt, Syria, Macedonia, and Cyrene. His inscriptions mention the names of contemporary rulers such as Antiochus II and Ptolemy III, showing a wide diplomatic vision. Instead of war, Ashoka now emphasized peaceful coexistence and the exchange of ideas and values. Ashoka's support for Buddhism was both personal and institutional. He built monasteries, sponsored the construction of stupas, and supported the monastic community through endowments. He convened the Third Buddhist Council at Pataliputra, led by the elder Moggaliputta Tissa, to resolve doctrinal disputes and purify the Sangha. The emperor also played a crucial role in spreading Buddhism beyond India. He sent missionary delegations to regions as far as Sri Lanka, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean world. The most famous of these missions was led by his son Mahinda and daughter Sanghamita to Sri Lanka, where they converted the ruling monarch and helped establish Buddhism as a lasting tradition. Sanghamita is also credited with bringing a sapling of the Bodhi tree to Anuradhapura, where it is still venerated today. Despite his moral transformation, Ashoka did not abandon governance. He remained an active ruler, issuing policy directives, overseeing justice, and maintaining the empire's infrastructure. Roads were built or improved, rest houses and wells were constructed for travelers and merchants, and medical services were extended to humans and animals alike. However, the shift from a militaristic empire to a moral commonwealth was not without challenges. Ashoka's emphasis on dharma and ethical persuasion may have reduced the focus on military preparedness and centralized enforcement. Some scholars argue that this contributed to the weakening of Mauryan control in outlying regions toward the end of his reign. Ashoka died around 232 BCE after ruling for nearly 4 decades. His passing marked the beginning of a gradual decline in the Mauryan Empire. His successors, lacking his vision and charisma, struggled to maintain unity and control. But Ashoka's legacy endured, both in India and across Asia. For Buddhists, he became the archetypal Dharmaraja, the righteous king who protected and promoted the faith. In Indian political thought, he set a model for ethical governance that would influence later rulers and thinkers. His inscriptions remain among the oldest deciphered records of Indian history, offering insight not only into state policy, but into the mind of a ruler seeking wisdom through humility. Ashoka was not the first ruler to reflect on the responsibilities of power, but he was among the few in antiquity to institutionalize ethics as a tool of governance. His transformation from conqueror of Kalinga to proponent of nonviolence is a rare example of political remorse shaping public policy on such a scale. Ashoka's death around 232 BCE marked the end of an extraordinary era of moral governance and religious patronage. His reign had elevated the Mauryan Empire to its ethical zenith, but even as his legacy endured in inscriptions and monasteries, the political foundation of the Mauryan state began to weaken. Over the next century, the empire that had once unified much of the Indian subcontinent gradually fractured. Central authority eroded, and India once again entered a period characterized by regional kingdoms, local rulers, and competing power centers. Ashoka's immediate successors lacked both his vision and his charisma. The names of several Mauryan emperors appear in later texts: Dasharatha, Samprati, Shalishuka, Devavarman, and Brihadratha. But their reigns are poorly documented and in most cases short-lived. While some of them continued Ashoka's patronage of Buddhism and maintained aspects of his administrative system, they struggled to assert effective control over the sprawling empire. The very scale of the Mauryan Empire became its greatest vulnerability. With territories stretching from the Himalayas to the Deccan and from Bengal to the Afghan frontier, the empire required strong leadership, efficient communication, and constant surveillance. Ashoka's emphasis on nonviolence and moral persuasion, though admirable in its intent, may have also reduced the empire's ability to respond forcefully to rebellion and external threats. One of the first regions to break away was the northwestern frontier. As early as Ashoka's final years, control over regions like Gandhara and Bactria weakened. These areas were closely connected to Central Asian trade routes and exposed to incursions from beyond the Hindu Kush. Around 230 BCE, a Greco-Bactrian ruler named Demetrius invaded parts of northwestern India, establishing what came to be known as the Indo-Greek kingdoms. Meanwhile, in the heartland of Magadha, internal dissent and dynastic conflict further destabilized the empire. Court intrigue, succession disputes, and the loss of loyal provincial governors led to a slow but steady decline in central authority. The provincial elites who had once served the Mauryan administration began asserting their independence, carving out regional domains with their own armies and bureaucracies. The final blow to the Mauryan dynasty came during the reign of Brihadratha, the last recorded Mauryan emperor. By this time, real power had shifted to his general, Pushyamitra Shunga, who served as commander of the imperial army. According to later sources, including the Harshacharita by Banabhata and various Puranic texts, Pushyamitra orchestrated a coup, assassinating Brihadratha during a public parade and declaring himself king. This event, dated to around 185 BCE, marked the formal end of the Mauryan Empire and the beginning of the Shunga dynasty. Pushyamitra Shunga's rise is often portrayed in religious terms, particularly in Buddhist accounts, which accuse him of persecuting Buddhists and destroying monasteries. However, these claims may reflect later sectarian tensions rather than accurate history. While the Shungas did favor Brahmanical traditions and revived Vedic rituals like the Ashvamedha, there is also evidence that Buddhism continued to thrive during this period, particularly in regions beyond Magadha. What is clear is that the fall of the Mauryas led to a return to regionalism. India once again became a patchwork of kingdoms, some large and ambitious, others small and localized. The Shungas ruled much of the central Gangetic plain. The Satavahanas emerged in the Deccan. In the northwest, Indo-Greek rulers established culturally hybrid states. In Tamilakam, the Cholas, Pandyas, and Cheras grew in strength, maintaining a distinct Dravidian identity. This period of political fragmentation did not result in cultural stagnation. On the contrary, it was a time of artistic innovation, philosophical debate, and regional experimentation. The interaction between Hellenistic, Iranian, and Indian traditions in the northwest gave rise to Greco-Buddhist art, seen most vividly in the Gandhara school. These sculptures blended Indian themes with Greek techniques, producing realistic depictions of the Buddha with flowing robes and expressive features. Trade also remained vibrant. Indian goods continued to reach the Mediterranean through overland and maritime routes. Roman coins, Egyptian artifacts, and Central Asian goods found their way into Indian markets. The port cities along the western and eastern coasts of India became hubs of international commerce, linking the subcontinent to global economic networks. Administratively, the post-Mauryan kingdoms often retained elements of Mauryan governance. Local bureaucracies, tax collection systems, and urban planning models reflected the enduring influence of Mauryan statecraft. However, kings now had to rely more heavily on alliances, military strength, and religious patronage to maintain their legitimacy. In this competitive landscape, religion played a renewed role in royal identity. The Shungas emphasized Vedic rituals, while the Satavahanas promoted both Brahmanical and Buddhist causes. Jain communities continued to flourish, particularly in western and southern India. New sects and schools of thought emerged, and the construction of stupas, temples, and monasteries continued at a steady pace. One of the most iconic monuments from this transitional era is the stupa at Bharhut, likely commissioned during the Shunga period. Its elaborate railings and carved panels depict scenes from the life of the Buddha and stories from the Jataka tales, reflecting a synthesis of artistic creativity and religious devotion. As India entered the 1st century BCE, the political fragmentation remained, but the cultural and religious foundations laid during the Mauryan period continued to evolve. The ideal of a just and moral ruler, embodied by Ashoka, persisted in memory and inscription. Yet the realities of power had returned to a more pragmatic and often militarized model. As the Mauryan Empire faded from the political stage and regional powers began to reassert themselves across the Indian subcontinent, new players emerged from the northwestern frontier. Among these were the Indo-Greeks, a series of Hellenistic rulers who established their presence in parts of modern-day Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northwestern India. Their arrival did not mark a fresh conquest by a distant empire, but rather the continuation of cultural and political interactions that had begun during the time of Alexander of Macedon. What followed was a unique period of fusion, where Indian and Hellenistic traditions intertwined to create enduring legacies in art, religion, and governance. The roots of the Indo-Greek kingdoms can be traced back to the Greco-Bactrian realm, which emerged after the disintegration of Alexander's vast empire. Following his withdrawal from India and his subsequent death, control over his eastern territories passed to the Seleucid Empire. However, by the 3rd century BCE, the Seleucid hold over Bactria and surrounding regions had weakened. Local Greek governors asserted independence and formed the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, with its center in what is now northern Afghanistan. It was from this base that Indo-Greek rulers began to push southeast into Indian territory. Around 200 BCE, Demetrius, a Greco-Bactrian king, led a campaign into the Punjab region. This incursion marked the beginning of sustained Greek political presence in India. Over the next century and a half, a series of Indo-Greek monarchs ruled over varying territories, sometimes independently, sometimes in overlapping domains. One of the most prominent Indo-Greek rulers was Menander, known in Indian sources as Milinda. He likely reigned during the mid-2nd century BCE and established his capital at Sagala, identified with modern-day Sialkot. Menander was a dynamic and capable ruler who extended his influence deep into the Gangetic Plain. But beyond military achievements, he is remembered for his engagement with Indian philosophy and religion. The Buddhist text Milinda Panha, translated as The Questions of King Milinda, presents a dialogue between Menander and the monk Nagasena. In this work, Menander poses challenging philosophical questions about identity, rebirth, and the nature of the self. Nagasena responds with clarity and logic, leading Menander to accept Buddhist teachings. Though the historicity of the entire dialogue is debated, the text reflects a genuine cross-cultural encounter. According to tradition, Menander eventually became a Buddhist and renounced his throne. This interaction symbolizes a broader pattern. The Indo-Greeks, while retaining Hellenistic political structures and language, did not remain culturally isolated. They minted coins with bilingual inscriptions, Greek on one side, Prakrit written in Kharoshthi or Brahmi on the other. These coins often featured images of Greek deities alongside Indian symbols like elephants, lions, or the wheel of Dharma. In some cases, Indo-Greek kings issued coins bearing the image of the Buddha, making them among the earliest rulers to do so. The influence of the Indo-Greeks extended deeply into art and iconography. Nowhere is this more visible than in the Gandhara school of art, which flourished in the northwest and combined Hellenistic techniques with Buddhist themes. The Gandhara style introduced realistic human figures, naturalistic drapery, and detailed facial expressions into Indian religious art. For the first time, the Buddha was represented in anthropomorphic form rather than through symbols like the Bodhi tree, footprints, or the Dharma wheel. These artistic innovations would go on to influence Buddhist art across Central Asia and East Asia. The political landscape during this period was far from unified. The Indo-Greek kingdoms were fragmented, with multiple rulers often governing small regions simultaneously. Power shifted rapidly, and succession disputes were common. Nonetheless, the impact of their rule was felt far beyond their borders. They acted as intermediaries in the movement of goods, ideas, and technologies between India, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean world. The Silk Road, though not yet fully formed, was beginning to emerge as a network of trade routes connecting China to the West. Indo-Greek territories played a crucial role in facilitating this exchange. Indian spices, textiles, and gemstones moved westward, while glassware, wine, and precious metals came from the Hellenistic world. More importantly, religious and philosophical ideas began to travel across these routes. Buddhist missionaries, sponsored by kings and monastic communities, took advantage of these connections to spread the teachings of the Buddha across Central Asia. Many of these early transmissions passed through Indo-Greek areas. Over time, Buddhism would travel to China, Korea, and Japan, but its first international expansion began in this culturally hybrid borderland. The Indo-Greek period also witnessed intellectual exchanges in astronomy, medicine, and language. Elements of Greek astrology and astronomical calculation merged with Indian traditions, contributing to the development of the Yavana school of Indian astronomy. Some Greek medical knowledge may have influenced Indian Ayurvedic practice, though the extent of this exchange remains debated. The Indo-Greeks never succeeded in establishing a unified or long-lasting empire. By the 1st century BCE, their territories began to shrink under pressure from new groups arriving from the northwest. Chief among these were the Indo-Scythians, or Shakas, nomadic tribes from Central Asia who displaced the Greeks and established their own kingdoms in the region. These transitions, however, did not sever the cultural ties that had been formed. Instead, new rulers often adopted the symbols, languages, and religious affiliations of their predecessors. In retrospect, the Indo-Greek period stands out not for its political stability, but for its cultural dynamism. It was a time when artistic forms were reinvented, religious ideas traveled across boundaries, and rulers from distant lands engaged deeply with local traditions. The fusion of Greek and Indian elements created something new, something that would persist in the architecture, coinage, and iconography of the centuries that followed. As the Indo-Greek kingdoms declined under pressure from Central Asian tribes and internal fragmentation, a new power emerged on the northwestern frontier of the Indian subcontinent. This was the Kushan Empire, a dynasty of nomadic origin that would go on to become one of the most influential political, cultural, and economic powers in early Indian history. The Kushans not only controlled key territories, but also turned India into a major node of Eurasian connectivity during what is now known as the Silk Road Age. The Kushans belonged to a larger group of nomadic peoples known as the Yuezhi. Originating in the grasslands of northwestern China, the Yuezhi had been displaced by the rising power of the Xiongnu and began migrating westward. By the 2nd century BCE, they had settled in Bactria, in present-day northern Afghanistan. Over time, one branch of the Yuezhi consolidated its power and established what came to be known as the Kushan Empire. The first significant ruler of this dynasty was Kujula Kadphises, who unified the Yuezhi clans and began expanding into the Indian subcontinent around the early 1st century CE. His successors would further extend this empire, encompassing large parts of present-day Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern India. Under the reign of Bhima Kadphises, the empire consolidated its hold over the northwestern plains and began issuing coins that featured both Indian deities and Roman-style motifs, reflecting a cosmopolitan worldview. However, it was under Emperor Kanishka the Great that the Kushan Empire reached its zenith. Kanishka, who likely ruled in the 2nd century CE, is one of the most celebrated rulers of ancient India. He inherited a vast empire that stretched from Central Asia to the Gangetic Basin and from the foothills of the Himalayas to the western Deccan. His capital cities included Purushapura, modern-day Peshawar, and Mathura, both of which became vibrant centers of culture, art, and commerce. Kanishka is perhaps best remembered for his patronage of Buddhism. Like Ashoka before him, Kanishka embraced Buddhist ideals, but he did so in a more international context. He convened the Fourth Buddhist Council in Kashmir, which sought to systematize Buddhist texts and doctrines. This council played a crucial role in shaping the emerging Mahayana tradition, which emphasized the role of the bodhisattva and the ideal of universal compassion. Under Kanishka and his successors, Mahayana Buddhism flourished. Monasteries received royal patronage, and stupas were built or expanded across the empire. The spread of Buddhism beyond India accelerated during this time. From Kushan-controlled territories, monks and missionaries traveled along trade routes into Central Asia, China, and eventually Korea and Japan. Buddhist art and scripture moved with them, carried not only by religious travelers but also by caravans and merchants. The Kushan Empire's strategic location at the crossroads of major trade routes allowed it to serve as a bridge between East and West. The Silk Road, though not a single road but a network of land and sea routes, connected China with the Roman Empire, passing through Central Asia and northern India. The Kushans facilitated this movement of goods, people, and ideas. Indian textiles, spices, and precious stones moved westward, while Chinese silk, Central Asian horses, and Roman glassware flowed eastward. This economic prosperity was reflected in the empire's coinage. Kushan coins were among the most diverse and sophisticated of the ancient world. They bore inscriptions in Greek, Bactrian, and Prakrit, and depicted a pantheon of deities from various traditions: Greek, Zoroastrian, Hindu, and Buddhist. Kanishka's coins, for example, featured images of Shiva, Buddha, and even Greek gods like Helios. This eclecticism was not merely decorative, it symbolized the empire's multicultural ethos and its role as a meeting point of civilizations. The Gandhara and Mathura schools of art also reached new heights during this period. Gandhara, located in the northwest, continued to produce Greco-Buddhist sculptures with realistic human features and classical drapery. Mathura, further east, developed a distinct Indian style with fuller figures, rich ornamentation, and spiritual expressiveness. Together, these two artistic traditions enriched the visual culture of ancient India and left a legacy that would influence Buddhist art for centuries. The Kushans also contributed to developments in architecture, language, and science. Urban centers grew in scale and complexity, with fortified cities, structured marketplaces, and monumental buildings. Sanskrit gained prominence as a court and literary language, promoted alongside local dialects. Advances in astronomy, medicine, and mathematics continued to be made, particularly in the scholarly environments fostered by monasteries and royal patronage. Despite its achievements, the Kushan Empire was not immune to decline. By the 3rd century CE, the empire faced pressures on multiple fronts. In the northwest, the rising Sasanian Empire of Persia began reclaiming territories once held by the Indo-Parthians and Kushans. In the Indian subcontinent, new powers such as the Gupta dynasty began asserting control over the Gangetic heartland. Internal divisions among Kushan rulers also weakened the empire's cohesion, with separate branches emerging in different regions. By the 4th century CE, the Kushan Empire had fractured into smaller successor states. In the northwest, the remnants of Kushan rule continued under the so-called Little Kushans, while in northern India, the Guptas began to establish themselves as a dominant force. Nevertheless, the cultural and religious influence of the Kushans far outlasted their political power. The legacy of the Kushan Empire lies in its unique synthesis of cultures, its facilitation of transcontinental exchange, and its promotion of Buddhism as a universal faith. The cosmopolitan spirit of the Kushans helped shape the identity of ancient India not as an isolated land, but as a dynamic participant in a wider world. Their patronage of Mahayana Buddhism laid the groundwork for the religion's global expansion, and their artistic contributions transformed visual representations of the sacred. In many ways, the Kushan period represents a golden age of interaction, when political ambition, religious devotion, and commercial enterprise came together to create a remarkable chapter in the history of South Asia. As the Silk Road pulsed with movement and exchange, the Indian subcontinent stood not at the edge of the ancient world, but at its center. While the northern and northwestern regions of the Indian subcontinent were shaped by empires such as the Mauryas, Indo-Greeks, and Kushans, the southern peninsula experienced a distinct trajectory. It was here, in the fertile lands of Tamilakam, the ancient name for the Tamil-speaking regions of southern India, that a vibrant cultural and literary flowering took place between roughly 300 BCE and 300 CE. This period is known as the Sangam Age, named after the legendary assemblies of poets and scholars who composed some of the earliest known Tamil literature. Tamilakam, encompassing the modern states of Tamil Nadu and parts of Kerala, was home to several powerful dynasties during this period. The 3 most prominent were the Cholas, the Pandyas, and the Cheras. Though these kingdoms were often in competition, they shared cultural and linguistic ties that shaped a unified Tamil identity. Unlike the Sanskritized polities of the north, the kingdoms of the south developed their own traditions of governance, religion, and literature, deeply rooted in local customs and landscapes. The term Sangam refers to gatherings of poets and scholars who are believed to have convened under royal patronage to compose and compile poetry. Though the historicity of these assemblies, sometimes described as 3 successive Sangams, is debated, the literature that survives from this period is both rich and revealing. Known collectively as Sangam literature, it includes a variety of poetic anthologies that explore themes such as love, war, ethics, nature, and kingship. The poems are often classified into 2 broad categories, Akam and Puram. Akam poems deal with the inner world of personal emotions, love, longing, and relationships. These verses are highly symbolic, using landscapes such as mountains, forests, seashores, and agricultural fields to evoke moods and situations. Puram poems, by contrast, focus on the external world, valor in battle, the generosity of kings, the ethics of governance, and the struggles of war. Together, they offer a remarkably nuanced view of ancient Tamil society. One of the most celebrated poets of this era was Avvaiyar, a revered female poet whose verses combined moral instruction with lyrical beauty. She was among many voices, both male and female, who contributed to the democratic spirit of Sangam poetry. These works were often composed in praise of specific rulers, but they also reflected deep empathy for human suffering, ecological awareness, and respect for all forms of life. The political structure of Tamilakam during the Sangam period was organized around monarchical rule supported by councils of ministers and local chieftains. The kings of the Chola, Pandya, and Chera dynasties patronized poets, built irrigation systems, and maintained standing armies. While each dynasty had its own capital and courtly traditions, all were engaged in continuous military rivalry and strategic alliances, shaping a dynamic and competitive political landscape. The Cholas were based in the Kaveri Delta and excelled in agricultural productivity and maritime trade. The Pandyas ruled from the city of Madurai, which became a prominent center of learning and poetry. The Cheras controlled the western coast, including parts of present-day Kerala, and were known for their access to the Arabian Sea and flourishing spice trade. Trade played a central role in the economy of Tamilakam. The region's location along the Indian Ocean and its access to ports made it a vital part of international maritime networks. Roman coins, amphorae, and pottery have been found at archaeological sites such as Arikamedu, indicating active trade between Tamil merchants and the Roman world. Goods exported from the south included pepper, pearls, ivory, textiles, and gemstones. In return, luxury items and currency flowed into the region, enriching local economies and royal treasuries. This era also saw the rise of sophisticated urban centers. Ports like Mauryas on the Malabar coast and Kavaripattinam on the eastern seaboard grew into bustling trade hubs. These cities hosted a cosmopolitan mix of traders from Arabia, Greece, Egypt, and Southeast Asia. The presence of such foreign communities introduced new ideas and practices while enhancing the prestige of local rulers. Religion in the Sangam Age reflected both continuity and diversity. The people of Tamilakam worshipped a variety of deities, many of whom were rooted in folk traditions. Murugan, associated with youth and war, was a particularly popular deity. Other important gods included Mayan, associated with Vishnu, Sayon, another form of Murugan, and Koravai, a goddess of victory and fertility. These deities would later be absorbed into broader Hindu traditions, but during this period they were worshipped through local rituals, festivals, and offerings. Ancestor worship, nature veneration, and spirit cults were also widespread. Rituals often took place in open-air shrines or sacred groves rather than in monumental temples. Buddhism and Jainism, which had found fertile ground in other parts of India, also had a presence in Tamilakam, particularly in the form of monastic centers and rock-cut caves. The interaction of these various beliefs fostered a climate of religious pluralism. Another distinctive feature of Sangam society was its social structure. While hierarchical divisions existed based on occupation and clan affiliation, there was a notable emphasis on honor, personal valor, and reputation. Warrior chiefs were admired for their bravery and generosity, while poets and bards held high social status due to their ability to immortalize deeds in verse. Women appear in the literature not only as romantic figures, but also as thinkers, ascetics, and heroines, suggesting a complex and multifaceted role in society. Education and literacy were valued, especially in the context of poetic composition and oral tradition. Bards memorized and performed long poetic compositions, often accompanied by music. The oral nature of Sangam literature ensured its preservation across generations, even before it was eventually written down in manuscripts centuries later. Archaeological evidence supports the literary picture of a vibrant and prosperous society. Excavations at sites like Kijadi in Tamil Nadu have uncovered urban planning, craft production areas, and inscriptions in early Tamil Brahmi script. These findings suggest a level of complexity and urban sophistication that parallels developments in the north, though with distinct regional features. The Sangam Age represents a cultural renaissance in southern India, an age of poetry, trade, political ambition, and religious diversity. Its contributions to Tamil language and identity are lasting. Even today, Sangam texts are taught in schools, quoted in public discourse, and revered as foundational works of Tamil literature. This period also marks the emergence of a uniquely southern form of Indian civilization, one that was not derivative of northern models, but grounded in its own ecology, history, and cultural sensibilities. The synthesis of martial valor, poetic elegance, and commercial dynamism created a legacy that would continue to influence southern India for centuries. Following the decline of the Kushan Empire and the fragmentation of political power across northern India, the early centuries of the Common Era were marked by regional kingdoms, localized rule, and intermittent instability. However, by the beginning of the 4th century CE, a powerful new dynasty arose in the Gangetic heartland, the Gupta dynasty. Over the next 2 centuries, the Guptas would unify large portions of northern India and preside over what is often remembered as the classical Golden Age of Indian civilization. This was not the first time India had seen imperial unification. The Mauryan Empire centuries earlier had accomplished this on an even broader scale. Yet the Gupta era was distinct for a different reason. It was an age in which political stability combined with economic prosperity, cultural creativity, and scientific innovation to create a flourishing of intellectual and artistic life that would influence India and the wider world for centuries to come. The founder of the Gupta dynasty was Sri Gupta, a relatively obscure regional chief. His descendants gradually expanded their domain, and by the time of Chandragupta I, who ascended the throne around 320 CE, the Guptas had begun to assert themselves as a major power. Chandragupta I married a Lichchavi princess, securing a politically valuable alliance with a respected lineage. This marriage helped to legitimize Gupta rule and establish their dominance in the fertile plains of Magadha. Chandragupta I's son, Samudragupta, was one of the most dynamic and militarily accomplished rulers in Indian history. His reign, spanning the mid-4th century CE, was characterized by extensive campaigns that expanded Gupta influence across much of the subcontinent. An inscription on the Allahabad pillar, carved in classical Sanskrit using the refined poetic style of the time, details his conquests. According to the inscription, Samudragupta defeated numerous kings in the north, subdued tribal rulers in central India, and received tribute from kings in the south. Although these claims may include poetic embellishment, they reflect the ambition and wide reach of Gupta diplomacy and military strength. Yet, Samudragupta was not only a conqueror, he was also a patron of the arts and a skilled poet and musician. His coins depict him playing the veena, a classical Indian stringed instrument, offering an image of the ideal king as both warrior and cultured intellectual, a concept that became central to Gupta kingship. Samudragupta was succeeded by Chandragupta II, also known by the title Vikramaditya. Under his reign, which began in the late 4th century CE, the Gupta Empire reached its peak. He defeated the powerful Shaka rulers of western India, bringing important regions such as Gujarat and Malwa under Gupta control. This expansion allowed the Guptas to dominate key trade routes and port cities, enhancing their wealth and influence. Chandragupta II's court became a beacon of learning and culture. The legendary circle of 9 scholars, referred to in later texts as the Navaratnas or 9 gems, was said to have included poets, mathematicians, grammarians, and astronomers. Although the historicity of this exact group is debated, there is no doubt that the Gupta court supported a vibrant intellectual environment. One of the most celebrated literary figures of this era was Kalidasa, widely regarded as the greatest Sanskrit poet and playwright. His works, including Shakuntala, Meghaduta, and Raghuvamsha, combined linguistic elegance, emotional depth, and refined aesthetics. Kalidasa's plays and poems became benchmarks of classical Sanskrit literature and were admired for centuries throughout Asia. The Gupta period also witnessed remarkable advancements in science and mathematics. The mathematician Aryabhata, writing in the 5th century CE, composed the Aryabhatiya, a groundbreaking work on arithmetic, algebra, and astronomy. Aryabhata introduced concepts such as the approximation of pi, the concept of zero as a placeholder, and calculations related to planetary motion. His assertion that the Earth rotates on its axis marked a significant departure from earlier cosmological models. Another important scholar of the time was Varahamihira, who wrote extensively on astronomy, astrology, and natural sciences. His encyclopedic work Brihat Samhita covered a wide range of topics, from weather forecasting and architecture to gemology and rituals. These scientific texts demonstrated not only theoretical knowledge but also practical application, particularly in fields like calendar reform, timekeeping, and urban planning. Medicine also advanced during this period. The Karaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita, though composed earlier, were copied, studied, and expanded during the Gupta era. These foundational texts of Ayurveda covered diagnostics, surgery, pharmacology, and the ethical responsibilities of physicians. Religious life during the Gupta period was marked by a revival of Brahmanical Hinduism, though not at the exclusion of other faiths. The Guptas themselves were Vaishnavas, devotees of Vishnu, but they patronized Shaivism and Shaktism as well. Temples began to take on more elaborate and permanent forms, replacing the earlier tradition of temporary shrines and open-air worship. Stone temples with intricate carvings and symbolic architecture became centers of spiritual, social, and economic activity. Important examples of early Gupta architecture include the Dashavatara temple at Deoghar and the cave temples of Udayagiri. These sites feature both structural innovations and narrative reliefs that depict scenes from epics such as the Ramayana and Mahabharata. The Gupta sculptural style emphasized grace, serenity, and idealized human forms, setting the standard for classical Indian art. Despite the resurgence of Hindu institutions, Buddhism and Jainism continued to thrive. Monasteries remained active in various regions, and Buddhist universities such as Nalanda began to gain prominence. The Gupta kings adopted a generally tolerant attitude toward religious diversity, allowing various communities to coexist and prosper. The Gupta period also had a well-organized administrative system. The empire was divided into provinces and districts, governed by officials who reported to the central authority. Land grants to brahmanas, religious institutions, and educational centers became common, often recorded on copper plates with detailed legal language. These grants were not only religious acts, but also a means of integrating local elites into the imperial framework. Economically, the Gupta era benefited from internal stability and international trade. Indian merchants exported spices, textiles, ivory, and gemstones, while importing silk and luxury goods from China and the Roman world. Coinage was standardized and widely circulated, with gold coins known as dinaras bearing images of Gupta rulers and deities. Travelers from other parts of the world took note of the prosperity and refinement of Gupta India. The Chinese Buddhist monk Faxian visited the subcontinent in the early 5th century CE and described a peaceful society with a well-functioning justice system and active religious life. He marveled at the absence of capital punishment, the generosity of the people, and the organization of Buddhist monastic institutions. However, the golden age of the Guptas was not without its challenges. By the late 5th century CE, external invasions began to erode the empire's stability. The most significant of these came from the Huna tribes, Central Asian nomads who crossed the Hindu Kush and launched attacks into northwestern India. Although Gupta resistance initially held them off, the prolonged conflict drained resources and weakened central authority. By the middle of the 6th century CE, the Gupta Empire had fragmented into smaller kingdoms. Regional dynasties began to assert their independence, and the unified cultural and political order gave way to a more decentralized landscape. Yet the legacy of the Guptas endured in literature, science, and religious tradition. The classical ideals shaped during this period continued to inform Indian civilization long after the empire's political collapse. Gupta-era texts remained central to education. Artistic motifs and temple designs influenced later dynasties, and the vision of a balanced, prosperous, and culturally rich Indian polity persisted in both memory and aspiration. As the Gupta Empire waned by the middle of the 6th century CE, India entered a new phase of cultural and religious transformation. The political unity of earlier centuries gave way to a mosaic of regional kingdoms. Yet far from signaling a decline, this period witnessed the deepening of spiritual life and the emergence of powerful cultural traditions. Among the most important developments was the rise of temple-based religion and the growth of bhakti, devotional worship centered on personal gods. The early centuries of this new era saw a shift in religious practice from Vedic sacrificial rituals and monastic ideals toward more direct, emotional forms of devotion. The gods of the Puranic tradition, Shiva, Vishnu, and Devi, became the focal points of worship, not just for priests or kings, but for the broader public. The Bhakti movement emphasized personal connection with the divine, often expressed through song, poetry, and prayer, and it marked a profound shift in religious consciousness across both northern and southern India. This change did not occur in isolation. It was shaped by a convergence of social, political, and theological currents. As the authority of centralized empires diminished, regional rulers emerged as patrons of religion and art. These kings often built temples, not only as places of worship, but also as symbols of their legitimacy and power. Temples began to replace Buddhist stupas and Jain sanctuaries as the dominant architectural form of sacred space. The growth of temple architecture during this period is one of the most visually striking developments in Indian history. The earliest Hindu temples were simple structures, often made of wood or brick. Over time, these evolved into monumental stone edifices, elaborately carved and richly symbolic. Two major styles began to crystallize: the Nagara style of the north and the Dravida style of the south. The Nagara style featured curvilinear towers called shikharas rising above the sanctum. These temples, often built on a high platform, included a sanctum, garbhagriha, a pillared hall, mandapa, and sometimes a circumambulatory path. The walls and ceilings were adorned with intricate sculptures depicting deities, celestial beings, mythological scenes, and everyday life. Temples such as those at Deoghar and Bitargaon are among the earliest surviving examples. In the south, the Dravida style developed distinct features, including tiered pyramidal towers, vimanas, massive gateway towers, gopurams, and spacious temple complexes enclosed by high walls. The Chalukya and Pallava dynasties were instrumental in developing this style. The rock-cut temples at Badami and the shore temples at Mahabalipuram are remarkable for their architectural innovation and sculptural richness. These temples were not merely religious spaces. They became social, cultural, and economic centers. They housed schools, libraries, and stores of grain. Festivals, markets, and community gatherings were organized around temple grounds. Temple rituals involved not just priests, but dancers, musicians, and artisans, all contributing to a vibrant religious life that touched every layer of society. Parallel to these architectural achievements was the flowering of devotional poetry. In Tamilakam, the Bhakti tradition was led by the Nayanars and Alvars, saint poets who composed hymns in praise of Shiva and Vishnu, respectively. These poets traveled from temple to temple, singing verses that expressed deep love, surrender, and longing for the divine. The Nayanars, devoted to Shiva, included figures from all social backgrounds: kings, peasants, women, and untouchables. Their poetry often criticized ritualism, caste arrogance, and hypocrisy, advocating instead a direct, passionate relationship with the deity. Similarly, the Alvars sang the glories of Vishnu in his various forms, portraying him as a savior who responds to the heartfelt devotion of his devotees. These bhakti movements challenged older hierarchies and introduced a more inclusive vision of spirituality. Their songs, composed in vernacular Tamil rather than classical Sanskrit, made religious experience accessible to a wider audience. Over time, these compositions were collected into anthologies such as the Tirumurai and Divya Prabandham, which remain central to Tamil religious practice. In the north, parallel devotional currents were beginning to stir. While the full flowering of northern bhakti would come later, seeds were already being sown in the worship of Krishna, Rama, and various forms of the goddess. The Puranas, Sanskrit texts composed and compiled over centuries, played a key role in popularizing devotional narratives and integrating local deities into a pan-Indian religious framework. Among these texts, the Bhagavata Purana stands out for its emphasis on bhakti toward Krishna. It narrates the life of Krishna, not only as a divine ruler and cosmic god, but also as a mischievous child, a playful lover, and a personal savior. These humanized portrayals brought the divine closer to the people and encouraged forms of worship that were emotional, personal, and expressive. The growing importance of bhakti also affected religious iconography. Sculptures of gods and goddesses became more expressive, capturing moments of grace, love, and power. Vishnu was shown reclining on the serpent Ananta, Shiva dancing the cosmic Tandava, and Devi in her many forms, from the gentle Lakshmi to the fierce Durga and Kali. These images were not merely symbolic. They were believed to be living embodiments of divine presence, charged through ritual and devotion. The expansion of temple worship and bhakti ideals did not erase older traditions. Buddhism and Jainism continued to exist, particularly in regions like Bihar, Karnataka, and Gujarat. In some areas, Jain patronage rivaled that of Hindu temples. The rock-cut Jain caves at Ellora and the monumental statues at Shravanabelagola bear witness to the enduring presence of Jain art and philosophy. At the same time, Buddhism began to lose royal patronage in many areas. The monastic institutions that had once flourished under the Mauryas and Guptas found it increasingly difficult to maintain their wealth and influence. As Hindu temples became more prominent and deeply integrated into village and state economies, Buddhist monasticism appeared increasingly detached from the lay population. Despite this decline, Buddhist centers like Nalanda and Vikramashila remained important for education and pilgrimage. These universities attracted students from across Asia, particularly China and Southeast Asia, where Indian forms of Buddhism were taking root. The transmission of Buddhist texts, rituals, and images along maritime and land routes continued during this period, reinforcing India's role as a religious and cultural center. Meanwhile, the integration of art, architecture, poetry, and ritual created a deeply immersive religious experience. The temple was not only a house for the divine, but a microcosm of the universe, its structure reflecting cosmological principles and mythological narratives. The devotee's journey through the temple, from outer courtyard to inner sanctum, symbolized a spiritual progression from the material world to divine union. The role of kingship also evolved in this context. Rulers now saw themselves as servants of the deity, dedicating temples and land to gods rather than to their own glory. Inscriptions from this period often describe kings as servants of Shiva or devotees of Vishnu, emphasizing their humility and piety. By linking their authority to the divine, rulers reinforced their legitimacy while also expressing the growing fusion of religion and state. This period set in motion long-lasting patterns in Indian religious life. The temple became central not just to worship, but to politics, economy, and culture. Bhakti, with its message of devotion, accessibility, and personal experience, would continue to shape Indian spirituality for centuries, inspiring poets, reformers, and saints across regions and languages. In the centuries following the decline of the Gupta Empire, India underwent a profound political transformation. The centralized imperial system gave way to a patchwork of regional kingdoms, each vying for influence, territory, and cultural prestige. This period, stretching from the early 7th century to the mid-8th century CE, is often referred to as the early medieval era. Far from being a time of stagnation, it was marked by the rise of powerful monarchs, the revival of urban centers, dynamic religious and artistic developments, and ongoing contests for regional supremacy. In northern India, one figure emerged to briefly restore a semblance of unity: Harshavardhana, often known simply as Harsha. Born into the Pushyabhuti dynasty of Thanesar in present-day Haryana, Harsha rose to prominence in the early 7th century CE, following a period of political instability. The assassination of his elder brother and the collapse of nearby kingdoms allowed Harsha to consolidate power across the northern plains. By the time of his coronation in Kanauj, an ancient city situated on the Ganga, Harsha had brought under his control a broad swath of territory that included parts of present-day Punjab, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and Bengal. Though his dominion did not match the geographic extent of the Mauryan or Gupta empires, Harsha effectively re-established centralized rule over much of the north. His administration relied on a network of provincial governors, a standing army, and diplomatic relationships with neighboring states. Harsha was also a notable patron of religion and culture. A devout follower of Mahayana Buddhism, he nonetheless adopted an inclusive policy, supporting both Buddhist and Hindu institutions. The Chinese monk Xuanzang, who traveled across India during Harsha's reign, provides a detailed account of his court and society. According to Xuanzang, Harsha held large religious assemblies where gifts were distributed to scholars, monks, and the needy. He also organized debates among Buddhist, Jain, and Brahmanical philosophers, reflecting the intellectual pluralism of the time. Beyond politics and religion, Harsha contributed to Sanskrit literature. He authored 3 plays, Nagananda, Ratnavali, and Priyadarshika, which display a high level of poetic and dramatic sophistication. His court was home to poets, scholars, and diplomats, continuing the cultural legacy of the Gupta era. However, after his death in the mid-7th century, the empire he had built disintegrated. With no strong successor, regional powers reasserted themselves, and Kanauj once again became a contested prize. Meanwhile, in the Deccan and the southern peninsula, powerful dynasties had begun to shape a parallel political order. Among the most prominent were the Chalukyas of Badami, who rose to power in the 6th century CE and reached their height under Pulakeshin II in the early 7th century. From their capital at Vatapi, modern-day Badami in Karnataka, the Chalukyas controlled a large portion of the western Deccan and acted as a bridge between northern and southern India. Pulakeshin II is remembered not only for his military successes, but also for his ability to resist northern expansion. His most famous confrontation was with Harsha himself. While Harsha had succeeded in subjugating many northern rulers, his attempt to move southward was halted by Pulakeshin. Inscriptions from the Aihole region proudly record this victory, portraying Pulakeshin as a powerful monarch who repelled the northern emperor. The Chalukyas were also known for their support of temple architecture and sculpture. The rock-cut cave temples at Badami and the structural temples at Patadakal, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, represent a confluence of northern and southern artistic traditions. These monuments showcase intricate carvings, detailed iconography, and experiments with architectural form that would influence later dynasties. To the southeast of the Chalukyas, the Pallavas emerged as a dominant force, ruling from their capital at Kanchipuram in Tamil Nadu. The Pallavas were contemporaries and sometimes rivals of the Chalukyas, and their military encounters, often fought over control of the eastern Deccan and Tamil regions, became legendary. Despite these conflicts, both dynasties contributed significantly to the cultural and religious life of the subcontinent. The Pallavas are especially renowned for their role in the development of Dravidian temple architecture. Under rulers such as Mahendravarman and Narasimhavarman, they sponsored the construction of cave temples and monolithic shrines at Mahabalipuram. These temples, carved directly into rock outcrops, depict scenes from the epics and celebrate the deeds of gods and kings. The famous Descent of the Ganga relief, with its vivid depiction of divine intervention and earthly life, stands as a testament to Pallava artistic ambition. Religiously, the Pallavas supported both Shaivism and Vaishnavism, while also tolerating Buddhist and Jain traditions. Inscriptions from this period reflect a deep engagement with philosophical questions and religious symbolism. Royal patronage was often extended to temples and monastic centers, reinforcing the role of religion as a key pillar of political authority. In the far south, the ancient Tamil dynasties, the Cholas, Pandyas, and Cheras, remained active, though they had not yet reached the imperial heights they would achieve in later centuries. During this period, they maintained their regional influence, engaged in maritime trade, and continued the literary traditions of the Sangam era. Local kings and chieftains contributed to temple construction and supported poets and scholars, ensuring the continuity of Tamil culture and identity. This era also saw the increasing influence of land grants and temple economies. Rulers from all regions issued copperplate inscriptions granting villages, tax exemptions, or agricultural land to temples and religious institutions. These grants not only served religious purposes but also helped consolidate political alliances and expand administrative control. The temples became centers of wealth and authority, managing land, collecting rents, and supporting artisans and workers. Despite frequent wars and dynastic rivalries, the early medieval period was marked by significant cultural exchange. The movement of scholars, traders, and pilgrims across regional boundaries facilitated the sharing of ideas, texts, and artistic techniques. The Sanskrit cosmopolitanism of earlier centuries was now complemented by vibrant regional languages and literary traditions. Inscriptions in Kannada, Telugu, and Tamil began to appear more regularly, marking the rise of vernacular expression alongside classical learning. Educational institutions also continued to flourish. While Nalanda remained a prominent center of Buddhist scholarship in the north, southern India developed its own schools of learning. Temples often housed libraries, employed learned priests, and became hubs of intellectual activity. Philosophy, logic, grammar, and ritual studies were pursued with vigor, creating a scholarly environment that bridged the sacred and the secular. The political fragmentation of this era did not lead to cultural decline. On the contrary, it allowed for a rich diversity of expression and experimentation. Each kingdom, while asserting its autonomy, contributed to a shared civilizational framework that valued literature, art, and spiritual thought. Regional identities were strengthened, but they were not isolated. Through trade, diplomacy, pilgrimage, and conquest, the various regions of India remained interconnected. As the early medieval period matured across the Indian subcontinent, the landscape continued to fragment into smaller yet powerful regional kingdoms. This was a time of transformation, marked by both internal evolution and external encounters. While southern India saw the continued rise of temple-building dynasties and cultural expansion, northern and northwestern India experienced the emergence of new political elites and the first sustained interactions with the Islamic world. One of the most defining features of this period was the rise of the Rajputs. The term Rajput, derived from the Sanskrit Rajaputra, meaning son of a king, referred to a warrior aristocracy that began to dominate the political landscape of northern and western India from around the 8th century onward. Though the precise origins of the Rajputs are debated, they appear to have evolved from a mixture of local chieftains, tribal leaders, and remnants of earlier dynasties who, over time, adopted martial traditions and claimed noble lineages. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Rajput clans such as the Pratiharas, Chauhans, Paramaras, and Guhilas had established their own kingdoms. They ruled from fortified capitals like Kanauj, Ajmer, Dara, and Chittorgarh, often asserting their legitimacy through grand temples, courtly patronage, and genealogical myths linking them to the solar or lunar dynasties of ancient epics. The Rajput political culture emphasized honor, lineage, and martial valor, and these ideals would come to define much of northern India's aristocratic identity for centuries to come. The Pratiharas, based in western India with their capital at Kanauj, were among the most powerful of these emerging Rajput dynasties. At the height of their power, they controlled much of north-central India and acted as a buffer between the western frontier and the heart of the Gangetic Plains. Their political strength, however, was not uncontested. They were engaged in a long-standing tripartite struggle with the Palace of Bengal and the Rashtrakutas of the Deccan, each of whom sought to control Kannauj, a city of great strategic and symbolic importance. The Rashtrakutas, although based in the south, conducted repeated campaigns into northern India. Their capital at Manyaketa was a center of administration and culture, and their patronage extended to both Jainism and Hinduism. The Rashtrakuta ruler Amogavarsha is remembered not only as a capable king but also as a scholar who composed works on poetics and Jain philosophy. Meanwhile, the Palace of Bengal played a significant role in keeping alive the traditions of Mahayana Buddhism in eastern India. The dynasty, founded by Gopala and expanded by Dharmapala and Devapala, became known for its support of monastic universities such as Nalanda, Vikramashila, and Odantapuri. These institutions attracted students and scholars from as far away as China and Southeast Asia, serving as beacons of Buddhist learning in an increasingly Hindu-dominated landscape. While these Indian kingdoms engaged in their rivalries, new forces were stirring on the northwestern frontier. From the early 8th century onward, the expanding Arab Islamic Caliphate began to make contact with the Indian subcontinent. The most significant early encounter came in the year corresponding to 712 CE, when an Arab general named Muhammad bin Qasim led a military expedition into Sindh in present-day Pakistan. This campaign, launched under the Umayyad Caliphate, resulted in the annexation of Sindh into the Islamic world. The Arab chroniclers described it as both a conquest and a civilizing mission, though the actual administration that followed was more pragmatic than ideological. Existing social structures were largely retained, and local rulers were often allowed to continue under Arab suzerainty in exchange for tribute and cooperation. The Arab presence in Sindh introduced Islam as a new religious and political force on the subcontinent. While conversion to Islam was limited in these early centuries, cultural exchanges began to take root. Arabic and Persian began to appear in inscriptions and documents. Trade between India and the Islamic world increased. Ideas in science, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine traveled in both directions, contributing to the intellectual cross-pollination that would characterize the wider medieval world. The Arabs were not the only ones to engage with India. Merchants and travelers from the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and Central Asia frequented Indian ports. Coastal cities such as Bharuch, Sopara, and Cambay in the west, and Tamralipta, Kaviripattinam, and Nagapattinam in the east and south, became bustling centers of maritime trade. These cities hosted diverse communities of Arab, Persian, Jewish, and Southeast Asian traders who lived and worked alongside local populations. The trade networks that connected India with the Islamic world brought not only goods, such as spices, textiles, and precious stones, but also religious ideas, architectural styles, and technological innovations. Mosques and Islamic settlements began to appear in coastal regions, though often as small communities integrated into the larger urban fabric rather than as political centers. Back in the interior, the Rajput states continued to evolve in ways that emphasized martial honor, courtly ritual, and religious patronage. Temples became not only places of worship, but also instruments of political expression. Rulers commissioned temple complexes with elaborate carvings, sacred texts, and sculptures that celebrated both divine figures and the king's own valor. The temple at Khajuraho, constructed by the Chandela dynasty, and the Sun Temple at Modhera, built by the Solankis, are prime examples of the architectural grandeur that characterized the Rajput courts. These temples reflected an evolving aesthetic that celebrated sensuality, cosmic order, and political power, all within the framework of sacred space. Religious life in this period remained pluralistic, though the balance was shifting. Buddhism, once dominant in many regions, continued to lose patronage and followers. While the great monastic universities still operated, they became increasingly isolated from mainstream political power. Hinduism, now shaped by Puranic traditions and temple worship, had grown in reach and accessibility. The rise of bhakti, especially in vernacular forms, brought devotional practices closer to the common people. Jainism, especially in Western India, continued to flourish under the patronage of merchant communities and regional kings. Jain monks and scholars composed texts, built temples, and engaged in philosophical debates, ensuring that Jain traditions remained vibrant and visible. In the Deccan, the later Chalukyas, sometimes referred to as the Chalukyas of Kalyani, revived earlier traditions and extended their influence over Karnataka and parts of Andhra. They were succeeded in many areas by the Western Chalukyas and the Yadavas, who maintained the regional balance of power. This period also saw the refinement of Indian languages and literary traditions. Sanskrit remained the language of elite culture, administration, and religious learning. At the same time, regional languages such as Kannada, Telugu, Marathi, and early forms of Hindi began to develop their own literatures, supported by local courts and religious institutions. Women continued to play complex roles in society. While elite women were often confined to domestic spaces, inscriptions from the period record women as patrons of temples, donors to religious causes, and occasionally as rulers or regents. The figure of the warrior queen, or the saint poetess, became increasingly prominent in regional folklore and devotional traditions. As the year 1000 approached, the political situation in northern India remained decentralized. The Rajput kingdoms were strong but often fractured. Their fierce loyalty to clan and region, combined with a code of honor that discouraged strategic alliances, made unified resistance difficult. This would prove significant in the coming century, as new waves of invaders from Central Asia, now fully Islamic in culture and politics, began to turn their attention toward the Indian heartland. As political power in northern India shifted among Rajput kingdoms and new Islamic influences began filtering through the northwestern frontiers, a very different transformation was taking place in the south. In the Tamil-speaking region of the peninsula, the Chola dynasty rose to unmatched prominence during the late 1st millennium CE. Over the course of 4 centuries, the Cholas would not only dominate South India, but also project power far beyond the subcontinent, through monumental architecture, administrative sophistication, and overseas expeditions that reached Southeast Asia. The Cholas had existed as a regional power for centuries prior, with mentions in Sangam literature and occasional appearances in early inscriptions. However, their rise to imperial status came during the 9th century CE under the rule of Vijayalaya Chola. He captured Thanjavur in the mid-9th century, establishing it as the capital and consolidating Chola rule in the Kaveri Delta. This region, with its fertile plains and proximity to coastal trade, provided a strong foundation for future expansion. Over successive generations, the Cholas extended their authority over neighboring territories, defeating rivals such as the Pallavas to the north and the Pandyas to the south. Under Rajaraja Chola I and his son Rajendra Chola I, the dynasty reached the height of its political and military power. Rajaraja Chola I, who came to the throne in the late 10th century CE, was a brilliant administrator and a capable military leader. He expanded Chola influence across much of southern India and Sri Lanka, establishing provincial governors and vassal states loyal to his rule. He also initiated a system of revenue collection, land surveys, and inscriptions that allowed the state to function with remarkable efficiency. His reign marked the beginning of imperial Chola power. However, it was Rajendra Chola I who elevated the Chola kingdom into a maritime empire. Embarking on naval campaigns, he launched successful expeditions across the Bay of Bengal. His forces raided ports along the eastern Indian coast, invaded Sri Lanka, and even reached as far as the kingdoms of present-day Indonesia and Malaysia, including the powerful Srivijaya Empire. These campaigns were not purely acts of conquest. They were also statements of prestige, designed to assert the Cholas' supremacy in the Indian Ocean. These overseas ventures, recorded in both inscriptions and foreign accounts, show the Cholas as active participants in the maritime trade networks connecting India to Southeast Asia and China. Chola ports like Nagapattinam, Puhar, and Kaveripattinam became centers for the export of textiles, spices, precious stones, and metalwork. In return, they imported goods such as horses, ceramics, and luxury items from Southeast Asia and China. The Cholas issued gold and copper coins that were used across their domains and likely circulated in foreign markets as well. The economic prosperity generated by this trade enabled the Cholas to undertake vast public works and monumental architecture. Nowhere is their cultural ambition more visible than in their temples. Rajaraja Chola I commissioned the Brihadiswarar temple at Thanjavur, a towering structure built entirely of granite, dedicated to Lord Shiva. This temple, with its grand vimana rising over 200 feet, was a statement of imperial might, artistic mastery, and spiritual devotion. It remains one of the finest examples of Dravidian temple architecture. The temple was not just a place of worship, it was a fully functioning institution. It employed priests, musicians, dancers, cooks, and artisans. It managed vast tracts of land and served as a center for education and administration. Inscriptions on the temple walls record detailed information about land grants, festivals, rituals, and salaries, offering a window into the inner workings of Chola society. Throughout the empire, similar temples were built in cities like Gangaikonda Cholapuram and Dharasuram. The Cholas patronized both Shaiva and Vaishnava traditions, as well as localized deities. Their rule saw the flourishing of devotional Hinduism, closely aligned with the temple economy and supported by poetic traditions that linked kingship with divine favor. Administratively, the Cholas developed a highly organized system. The empire was divided into units called mandalams, which were further broken into valanadas and nadis. Local governance was often managed by village assemblies, especially in the Tamil-speaking regions. These assemblies, such as the UR and Sabha, were composed of elders and influential landowners who managed irrigation, land disputes, and tax collection. In some cases, officials were selected by drawing lots, a practice known from inscriptions as kudavolai. This decentralized administration enabled efficient governance across vast territories. Chola inscriptions, often carved in precise Tamil, are among the most detailed and numerous in Indian history. They document not only royal decrees, but also endowments by private citizens, temple regulations, and international diplomacy. One notable inscription even refers to diplomatic relations with China, illustrating the global reach of Chola statecraft. Art and literature flourished under Chola patronage. Bronze casting reached an extraordinary level of refinement, producing iconic statues of deities such as Nataraja, the dancing Shiva, whose dynamic form and balance symbolize cosmic rhythm and divine grace. These bronzes were not merely artistic objects. They were used in rituals, processions, and festivals, bringing sacred imagery into public life. In literature, both Tamil and Sanskrit continued to thrive. Tamil devotional poetry, particularly by Shaiva and Vaishnava saints, was compiled into structured collections and given scriptural status. Texts such as the Periya Puranam, a hagiography of Shaiva saints, were written during the later Chola period and celebrated the lives of men and women who devoted themselves fully to the divine. Women in Chola society, especially those from elite backgrounds, played active roles in temple patronage and religious life. Queens and noblewomen commissioned shrines, donated lands, and participated in rituals. While social hierarchies remained, inscriptions suggest that women could exercise influence, particularly within the temple ecosystem. By the 12th century, however, the Chola Empire began to show signs of strain. Dynastic conflicts, succession disputes, and increasing pressure from rival powers, especially the rising Pandyas in the south and the Hoysalas in the Deccan, began to weaken centralized authority. Despite efforts by rulers like Kulotunga Chola and Rajadiraja to maintain control, the empire gradually fragmented. By the end of the 13th century, the once mighty Chola state had been reduced to a regional kingdom. Yet its influence lived on. The Chola legacy endured in art, architecture, administrative models, and maritime connections that would continue to shape South Indian identity for centuries. In many ways, the Chola period represented a culmination of trends long in development: the integration of kingship and temple worship, the maturity of Dravidian architectural forms, the deep connection between religion and political legitimacy, and the projection of Indian culture into the wider Indian Ocean world. Through both conquest and commerce, the Cholas affirmed that southern India was not peripheral but central to the story of the subcontinent and to the world beyond. As the 12th century drew to a close, the Indian subcontinent was poised on the edge of profound transformation. The centuries-long age of classical India, with its empires, temples, flourishing regional cultures, and rich traditions of learning, was giving way to a new historical phase shaped by fresh political forces and religious dynamics. The 12th and early 13th centuries marked the twilight of ancient India and the dawn of medieval India, a transition catalyzed by the military and cultural arrival of new powers from the northwest. By the beginning of the 11th century CE, the northern part of the subcontinent had fragmented into numerous Rajput-led kingdoms and principalities. Although culturally vibrant and militarily brave, these kingdoms were often embroiled in rivalries that prevented unified resistance against external threats. Among the most prominent Rajput rulers of this period was Prithviraj Chauhan, the king of Ajmer and Delhi, who would become a central figure in the unfolding story of conquest and change. The primary external force that disrupted the Indian political landscape was the rising power of Islamic dynasties in Central and West Asia. Over the previous centuries, the Islamic world had expanded rapidly, stretching from Spain to Central Asia. This expansion was not merely military, it was also economic, intellectual, and cultural. Indian cities, ports, and trade routes were already familiar to Arab merchants and Persian scholars. What changed in the 11th and 12th centuries was the scale and intention of military incursions from Central Asia into the Indian heartland. One of the most significant early invaders was Mahmud of Ghazni, who ruled from Ghazni in modern-day Afghanistan. Between the years corresponding to approximately 1000 and 1027 CE, Mahmud launched a series of raids into northern India, reportedly numbering over a dozen. These campaigns targeted wealthy temples and cities, including the famed temple of Somnath in Gujarat. Mahmud's objectives were complex. While the raids were motivated by economic gain and military prestige, they were also framed in religious terms. Ghaznavid chroniclers portrayed Mahmud as a champion of Islam against the perceived idolatry of India. However, in practice, his incursions did not result in lasting political occupation. Mahmud returned to Ghazni with treasures and captives, leaving behind destruction but not durable control. It was not until the late 12th century that a more permanent shift occurred. This time, it was not merely a raid, but a conquest. Muhammad Ghori, ruler of the Ghurid dynasty from the highlands of present-day Afghanistan, launched a concerted effort to establish a foothold in northern India. Unlike Mahmud, Ghori aimed not only to plunder, but to govern. His campaigns marked the beginning of a systematic process of annexation and administration. One of Ghori's most decisive battles was fought against Prithviraj Chauhan at Tarain, near modern-day Haryana. In the first battle, Prithviraj's forces successfully repelled the invaders. But in the second confrontation, fought roughly a year later, Ghori returned with a larger and more disciplined army. Prithviraj was defeated, captured, and, according to some sources, later executed. This marked a critical turning point in Indian history. Following the victory at Tarain, the Ghurid forces began consolidating their rule in northern India. Delhi, strategically located and already an important urban center, became the base of their administration. Governors and generals were appointed to oversee provinces, collect revenue, and manage military campaigns. Among these was Qutb al-Din Aibak, a former slave general who played a pivotal role in stabilizing Ghurid control. After the death of Muhammad Ghori, Qutb al-Din Aibak declared his independence and established what would come to be known as the Delhi Sultanate. This marked the beginning of Muslim rule in northern India on a sustained imperial scale. The transition was not merely a change in rulers. It initiated a long-term transformation in political systems, architectural styles, religious dynamics, and cultural interactions. The early Sultanate rulers built new structures of governance, adapted Persian administrative models, and introduced Arabic and Persian as languages of state. One of their earliest architectural contributions was the Qutb Minar, a towering minaret in Delhi that still stands as a symbol of the new order. The adjacent Quwat al-Islam Mosque was built using materials from earlier Hindu and Jain temples, reflecting both continuity and rupture. Despite the shock of conquest, the initial period of Sultanate rule also involved negotiation and adaptation. Many Hindu chieftains retained local power as vassals or tax collectors. Urban life continued, trade networks remained active, and agricultural productivity sustained state revenue. The court culture of the early Sultanate blended Central Asian, Persian, and Indian elements, creating a cosmopolitan world that would eventually give rise to Indo-Islamic civilization. This transition was not without resistance or conflict. Uprisings, local wars, and religious tensions occurred across the north. Yet the foundations laid during this period would shape the next several centuries of Indian history, culminating in the establishment of powerful empires such as the Delhi Sultanate and later the Mughal Empire. The south of India remained outside this immediate wave of conquest. The Cholas, though weakening, continued to hold power into the early 13th century. The Pandyas were beginning to assert themselves once again, and the Hoysalas maintained their stronghold in the Deccan. These kingdoms would continue to flourish and respond in varied ways to the changing dynamics of the north. With the conquest of Delhi and the rise of the Sultanate, the long arc of ancient India came to a close. What followed was not an erasure, but a transformation. The classical traditions of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism persisted, adapted, and interacted with the new Islamic ethos. Temples continued to be built, philosophers continued to write, poets continued to sing, but the political map had changed, and with it, the structures of power, identity, and cultural expression. The legacy of ancient India, from the cities of the Indus Valley to the empires of the Mauryas and Guptas, from the spiritual teachings of the Buddha to the majestic temples of the Cholas, remains etched in stone, scripture, and memory. It was a civilization defined by diversity, resilience, and creativity. As the medieval period began, India entered a new chapter, one marked by synthesis, tension, innovation, and exchange. The story of ancient India, though complete in historical terms, lives on in the cultural, religious, and philosophical foundations of the subcontinent even today.